Oliver Mellors, a young man from England, is working on a coal mine site as a gamekeeper when it happens in the mine. Mellors feels the ground tremble behind his feet and quickly charges towards the commotion. Without too much thinking, he naturally takes on the role of a leader. His every movement is charismatic and competent, but as the emergency van arrives, he's stripped from the leadership role, as usual. Afterwards, we are taken to a completely different setting. Constance, a young girl who's not used to supreme events like this, is walking through a house filled with wealthy people and respected gentlemen and ladies, dancing to delightful music. She's new to this place and hardly knows anyone at this party, other than her sister and her fiancé. She looks around and sees nothing but sluggish masks, failing to cover up the despair behind them. When a young man approaches her and asks her how she's enjoying the party, she answers honestly, thus winning the entirety of his attention. To her surprise, she quickly gets interested in this man, and soon they're having a delightful conversation. Then an even more unexpected thing happens. The man introduces himself to her as Clifford Chatterley, the host of the event. The two are getting married in the next scene, and as they spell out their vows of loyalty, the future events flash in front of our eyes. The passionate love and happiness of the first days of marriage are followed by some dreadful life events that are intertwined with the history of Europe. The Great War starts, and Clifford is forced to fight for his country. One time, when he gives out a command to leave the ditch and advance through the battlefield, a bomb explodes near him, and he's thrown many feet away. Suddenly, we see someone we recognize from the first scene, Oliver Mellors. He's looking down on Clifford Chatterley, thinking about what to do, and after a few seconds of observing the situation as adequately as possible amid the raging war, he decides to take the position of leader once more. He gives out a command to advance, and as he ascends, he ditches. In the next scene, Clifford is taken back home, where his entire family is waiting with widespread smiles and lovely eyes. Constance greets him first. She cannot wait to see him come down and embrace her firmly, but her husband takes an unusually long time. Suddenly, a wheelchair is rolled over at his feet, and a few men help him down the van and into the wheelchair. All the while, Constance's smile is unbroken, but her eyes scream in surprise. Clifford feels this, naturally. He makes one polite, official remark, and rolls inside his house. A short time later, the couple is alone in their room, discussing their option of curing his condition. But Clifford indirectly points out that it is incurable. There's one physicist in the area, however, who's known for accomplishing the impossible. Now, Constance changes the subject. The mere fact that her husband is alive and well is enough to make her happy, but all Clifford wants now is sleep. So he cuts this conversation short and asks her to fetch Mrs. Betts, their servant, to prepare the bed for him. Constance exits the room with watery eyes and explodes in tears. Mrs. Betts is waiting just outside the room. She tells Constance a few soothing words, but suddenly, they both hear an unusual clicking noise coming from the room. Constance immediately understands what is going on. She saw Clifford's eyes, so she reactively charges inside the room and saves Clifford from himself. She waves the servants away and calms Clifford down. The man is desperate. He thinks all the love and appreciation directed at him from now on will be filled with only pity and nothing else. But Constance assures him in this moment of pain and agony that she will always be by his side, not because of pity, but because of love. Mellors is writing a letter to his lover in the next scene, expressing to her his anticipation of their future reunion. When the chaos of the war stops abruptly, a teardrop rolls over Mellors' cheek, and he realizes to his delight that the war is over. Naturally, he makes his way towards his lover right away, as he gets back to his ordinary life. But once he stands beneath her window, he sees her partially and pregnant. Another man approaches her after a few seconds, and both disappear into the room. With this, Mellors slowly and sorrowfully walks away, realizing that his life will never be the same as before. The next morning, he has a job interview with Clifford Chatterley. He wants to work as a gamekeeper for him. The interview goes as usual. Clifford pays no special mind to Mellors at first, until the latter starts coughing. His forehead gets furrowed with veins, and his face goes red as he tries to keep it inside. Now Clifford realizes that the man in front of him has served in war and learns, to his surprise, that the Mellors served under his command. We don't know if they recognize each other, but a sense of camaraderie and respect for a fellow soldier forces Clifford to hire him. On the afternoon of the next day, Constance sees her husband drive around a yard with his new engineered vehicle. He's excited like a child, and we all laugh in delight as he pushes the throttle heedlessly. In the next scene, the husband and wife are making their way through the woods, having a conversation that only partially seems forced. They reach the cottage where Oliver works, and Clifford introduces him to his wife. After a few seconds, he sees a rabbit nearby, and commands Mellors to fetch him a gun. The latter does as he's bid, but his boss misses. He seems a little embarrassed afterwards, so he quickly changes subjects and asks Mellors to follow them out of the woods. The machine might need some mending on the way back, and his help might be needed. And so, they head back. Soon, Clifford sees another rabbit and asks for the gun again. He feels a need to prove to his wife that he's still a man, even though he cannot walk anymore. But to his surprise, Mellors strips him of this other opportunity. Instead of giving him the gun, Oliver shoots the himself. Naturally, Clifford reconsiders his initial command. He and his wife will get out of these woods by themselves. The next morning, Constance hurts her back while helping Clifford out of bed. This seems like an ordinary misfortune, but a fair bit of distress follows it soon after. That evening, Constance finds out that a female servant named Mrs. Bolton is bathing Clifford. He approaches the door and overhears a quite intimate conversation between the two. She chooses not to enter now, but she mentions this the next morning while having breakfast. She expresses her dislike of Mrs. Bolton's intimacy and the fact that all this happened without her consent. Clifford clearly doesn't get the frustration. He forthrightly expresses that Mrs. Bolton isn't a person in his eyes, but a mere servant. And since her service was immediately available, he took it without thinking much about it. Even though he expresses no intention to discuss this matter further, Constance doesn't yield back and makes him say the truth in the end. He's ashamed of his body and prefers his wife not to look at it. After admitting this, he quickly changes the subject and says that he has to go to the colliery for a mandatory inspection. Constance wants to follow him, but as he says, a colliery isn't a place for the lady. A short time later, Mrs. Betts catches Constance walking in the hall to inform her about a little problem involving Mr. Millers. It seems that the latter wants to have a key to his cottage, but there's nobody available to fetch it for him. At first, Constance says that this matter can wait, but then suddenly, she expresses a will to deliver it herself. Her eyes make it evident that this isn't a mere delivery to her. Mr. Millers has definitely gotten her attention. In the next scene, she knocks on his door. Millers makes countless mistakes here, both in terms of manners and in controlling his temper. He seems embarrassed and surprised, even smitten, that the lady of the house chose to visit him. When the latter mentions the key, Millers explodes, thinking that she's about to come up with some excuse not to give him the keys to his own cottage. Soon, however, he realizes that he made a bad mistake. Constance explains to him that she brought it herself, and Millers is left extremely ashamed. In the end, Constance just throws the key on the table and leaves the cottage. In the next scene, while her husband is at the colliery trying to prove that his manhood is still intact, Constance receives a letter on a silver platter. It turns out to be a short but concise apology letter from Oliver. The letter is so short that some would think the author did it only out of worry about his own skin. In the next scene, Constance visits him in the woods. From far away, she sees him shirtless, building something. She watches him like this for a while, until Millers' dog smells her from far away and starts barking. Now, Constance comes out of hiding and greets the man, who reactively starts covering his ness. After the apology, their second interaction should be at least a bit more respectful, but it actually proves to be worse. Millers seems to prefer being lonely. The presence of the lady of the house clearly embarrasses him, and furthermore, Constance understands now what the intent behind the apology letter was. Millers wrote it so that the fuss around this matter wouldn't continue, and reach the ears of Sir Clifford. Constance should be insulted that someone would think so lowly of her, but she sees now clearly that Millers' insolence is generalized. She chooses to change the subject to a much more satisfying matter, and mentions the peaceful atmosphere. She expresses her will to come here sometime to paint. To our surprise, even this sentence escalates into a misunderstanding, after Millers says that he will vacate the premises if her ladyship ever wishes to use it to her liking. He is clearly avoiding her. Eventually, as Constance is about to storm out of the woods, rain starts pelting down, and she realizes that the only shelter nearby is Oliver's cottage. They rush inside. Constance takes off her robe. Millers gets the fire going and lets the lady of the house warm herself, while he stands some distance away, looking at his feet. Constance asks him honestly and openly why he's so embarrassed. At first, Oliver is reluctant to answer, but then admits that if anybody sees the two of them like this, he will lose much more than his job. Silence falls. Constance knows that it is true, and as the man continues to look at his feet, she notices that the rain has stopped. She grabs her coat, thanks him formally, and exits the cottage. That night, Constance tries to be intimate with Clifford. It's been a long time since they shared love and warmth in bed, but Clifford seems unusually stiff and uninterested. His body is completely unresponsive. He thanks her quite formally and tells her that there is no use. There are other ways he can try to satisfy her, though, and Constance isn't ashamed to put her needs forward. But clearly Clifford has become too self-absorbed after the Great War. He simply says that he's too tired. The next morning, he expresses his extreme sorrow that he will never have a son. However, he adds that there is nothing that science cannot solve. And so a short time later, he's taking electrical therapy. Constance can hear terrible shouts and loud moans, and can barely endure them. Her husband is in unimaginable pain. In the evening, Constance decides that the therapy session has gone too far. She runs into the room where Clifford's being electrocuted and stops this nonsense immediately. Clifford is exhausted from pain. Gasping and sobbing convulsively, he can barely speak. Constance realizes that he is trying his best, but to her misfortune, she also understands that he's trying only for himself. The next day afternoon, Lady Chatterley is walking in the woods, trying to find solitude in her sorrows, when she hears a loud hammering noise. Knowing who it is, she makes her way towards it and finds Oliver, who is building a fence. Dozens of chicks are cheeping from the cages on the ground. Constance greets Mellors with an open smile and asks him to open one of the cages, to let her hold one. Mellors does as he is bid. As he hands her a chick, he feels a tide of some unknown, invisible energy course through his hand, like a potent electric shock. He avoids eye contact again as Constance holds one of the chicks. He makes a mistake then. Seeing how calm the bird is in her hands, he tells Constance that it has probably taken her as its mother. Motherhood is an extremely sorrowful matter for Constance. Without much conscious awareness, tears start rolling down her cheeks, and she gets fully swallowed by despair. She may never be a mother. Mellors watches her cry awkwardly and offers his hand and shoulder in sorrow. It has been a long time since someone offered Constance what she truly needs, so she cannot help but accept it. The soothing warmth coming from Oliver is overwhelming, and soon they both appear in the middle of an endless sea of passion. That evening, Oliver sees her ladyship out of the woods. He seems so swallowed by thoughts that before saying goodbye, Constance asks him if he's sorry for what they did, but it is quite the contrary. For Mellors, all hope of happiness was gone until today. His will to live is rekindled. In the next scene, Mrs. Bolton walks up to Constance while the latter is busy painting. Bolton apologizes and stands next to her. Clearly, she wants to discuss something important to her, but so far, silence is unbroken. Finally, Constance, as if she saw Bolton's sorrows in her eyes, asks her about her late husband. The Great War took him from Bolton and left her totally alone. It was 6 years ago, and still to this day, she craves his touch and his warm gaze. And as tears start building up in her eyelids, Constance realizes how much she has in common with this widow. The Great War didn't take Clifford, but the feelings that Bolton describes strangely resonate with Constance. That night, an upcoming storm rumbles in the sky. The lady of the house finds it impossible to sleep. She stands up and goes up to the window. Just past the meadow, a dim light in the woods is visible. Out of nowhere, some invisible power seizes Constance's heart, and she rushes outside towards that light to see Oliver, who's already on the verge of falling back in despair, thinking that Constance will never come back to him. Hardly a word can describe his relief when he sees Constance running to him in the middle of the stormy night. The next morning, while having breakfast, the husband and wife discuss the matter of their marriage. The absence of the child, or any form of sexual connection, is a dreadful problem, but Clifford decides to look away from it, saying that their spiritual connection is strong enough to withstand any obstacles. It's been a long time since the couple engaged in any form of entertainment, so they decide to change that. In the next scene, guests are arriving at their residence. Constance's sister is one of them. The latter knows Constance the best, so right away, she notices that there is an enormous secret in her mind. The sister connects some dots in a matter of seconds and finds out the vague truth immediately: Constance has a lover. The sisters laugh and joke around this matter. It is only natural, when Clifford has become a machine whose only concern is coal mining. Now, her sister demands to know who the mysterious man is. For a moment, Constance feels that she can finally share the truth with someone, that she can finally be honest with a person who's accepting, and she tells the truth. Silence falls, and the cheerful attitude dissipates. Dread and hostility appear in the eyes of Constance's sister, until Constance decides to fall back into her shell and laugh loudly and insincerely. She says she was just joking, and her sister's pale face starts returning to normal again. At the party, a man named Duncan Forbes makes an appearance. Constance is happily surprised to see him. She doesn't remember inviting him, but clearly, the two have a history of good friendship. Clifford looks at the man in a weird way. One cannot say that he's jealous or hostile towards this man, but there is still an underlying potent feeling behind his gaze. In the next scene, after Clifford successfully bores everyone with talking about coal, he says that he's tired and leaves the party. Just before exiting the room, he looks back and sees Duncan invite Constance to dance. He thinks to himself about something for a few seconds, but does nothing about it. The next morning, Constance understands why Duncan was at the party. Clifford reveals an unexpected truth, and it all turns into a terrible argument between the wedded couple. It seems like Clifford chose Duncan Forbes carefully out of a herd of renowned men and deliberately invited him to the party, knowing that he had loved Constance in the past. Clifford was hoping that the connection would be set between them, and that Duncan would be the one impregnating Constance, in place of her husband. Clifford needs an heir. This is why he did it all. Clearly, he didn't think about Constance at all. The latter is infuriated. Hardly anything can be as humiliating as this filthy plotline her own husband came up with. In the end, the fight between the couple isn't resolved. That afternoon, Constance is with Oliver in the cottage. Her anger is entirely gone. Suddenly, the two hear Mellors' dog bark. Oliver stands up and looks outside. There's no one around, and Constance is sure that nobody has seen her coming here, but a doubt is seated in Oliver's mind. There is a big chance that someone knows and is suspicious about Constance's frequent visits. The residence is full of eyes, so that night the couple goes someplace where nobody knows them. They sneak out of the residence into the crowded streets, full of ill-mannered people. Here, Connie Reed of Tavershall Village takes the place of the Lady Constance. They spend a wonderful time together, but there is still a bitter lesson in this detour for Constance. She cannot live this double life for long. In the next scene, she notices a great change in her body and realizes that she's pregnant. While walking across the hall to meet her husband, her anxiousness grows, until she puts on a mask of formality, knowing that it hides the distress the most. Their interaction is very brief. Clifford says dryly that this news makes him the happiest man on the planet. Only after Constance takes a few steps towards the entrance does Clifford get interested in who the man is. Constance merely answers that she will handle the man sensitively and with propriety, and so she keeps the identity of the real father intact. The sadness and distress paint Clifford's face only after his lady wife is gone. Later that day, he and Constance go to the woods to get a report from Mellors about the progress. While away from home, Clifford's machine gets stuck in mud and breaks down. He shouts Mellors' name, and the latter appears from the woods after a short period of time. He is asked politely to push the vehicle until the engine starts working again, and he does so. The engine starts running again, but the machine is still stuck. Here, Constance says she will call for additional help, or push him herself, but Clifford gets upset by this. He doesn't want everyone to witness his misery, and furthermore, in her condition, Constance shouldn't engage in that kind of physical activity. Mellors understands immediately what his boss means by this. Constance is pregnant with his child, and he didn't know. Now Mellors knows that Constance chose the life of a lady. She chose her husband over him. Oliver feels used, and it infuriates him. It gives him extra unlimited power, and he walks forward to push his master's machine out of the mud. He coughs and gasps for air as he breaks his back. Constance begs him to ask for help, but neither he nor Clifford have any intention to call for help. In the end, the machine is out and running. Clifford is cluelessly thankful, and Mellors is full of poisonous anger. When the husband and the wife go their separate ways, Constance scolds Clifford for showing such mercilessness, and insensitivity. She tells him to call a doctor and runs back to Mellors. Here, Clifford looks back at her frustrated and caring motion, and a sense of suspicion is seated in his mind. When Constance arrives at the cottage, Oliver doesn't accept her help. He lets his poisonous thoughts out, saying that Constance only wanted him to have a child. She only used him, like some people use well-bred animals to make good stock. The conversation heats up dramatically then, until Constance assures him that it isn't true. She wants only him. Now Oliver's suspicions are gone, but he, just like Constance, realizes that they can never be together. The realization comes abruptly, and it hurts them both very deeply. In the next scene, Constance is mourning her fate when Clifford approaches her. He says he knows about the possible ignorance regarding the father of the child, but all that matters is the health of the little one. Constance smiles forcefully and agrees, until Clifford adds that they shouldn't delay a formal announcement that they are expecting a child. They do not want rumors to spread. Once more, Constance is assured that all her husband wants is an heir and reputation. Later that day, Mrs. Bolton, who heard the conversation between the husband and the wife, visits Oliver's cottage and sees it empty. She walks around for some time and finds a diary. In the next scene, while hosting a party, Clifford receives a letter from Mrs. Bolton, asking him to meet immediately to discuss some urgent matters. Mrs. Bolton openly intends to bring this family down with the information she acquired through the diary. Clifford is infuriated and surprised. He sees that Constance's affair with Mr. Mellors will be known to everyone. He tries to deny it and frighten Bolton, but there is no use. He has nothing against this young servant, while the latter has every tool and reason to bring him down. A short time later, Clifford's outside getting fresh air when Constance comes out to see him. She's acting as if she's not frightened to hear about some dreadful news. Clifford tells her about Mrs. Bolton's discovery and blames her for everything. The next morning, Bolton is fired. Just before she leaves, Constance approaches her and demands to know where she got the information from. She walks up to her like an apex predator, but soon she breaks down in tears. Here, Bolton learns that Constance really loved Mellors, and she immediately feels an extreme amount of guilt. A wonderful love is destroyed, and it is all her fault. She thought she was doing the right thing by letting all her resentment out, but the outcome was clearly different. All she can do now is tell Constance to run to Oliver as quickly as possible. It might already be too late. The cottage seems abandoned when she gets there. Assured that her love is already far gone, Constance slowly exits and gets swallowed up by sorrow until she hears a dog bark. It's Mellors' hound. She looks up and sees him taking heavy steps towards her. The two embrace each other, and Constance, completely taken by the happiness, tells him to stay with her. He will be safe by her side, and they can leave together. But Mellors believes that he has nothing to offer. He wants to go alone. This is an expression of propriety in his mind, but to Constance, it's a surrender. She's convinced that Oliver has given up on their love, and she storms out. Mellors reflects on something for a while, and then, in a moment of complete realization, runs after her. This magical, healing power of her love that suddenly made its way into his life is the most precious thing he has, and there is nothing he believes in more. In the next scene, the two arrive at Clifford's work site, Constance enters his office and is immediately pelted with accusations. Pure love is the reason everything turned upside down, but she doesn't seek understanding. She knows Clifford will never choose to see things from her point of view, so the only thing she wants now is a divorce. She forthrightly tells him of this wish, but the latter only asks her to bring in Millers. Reluctantly, Constance calls for him, and as he enters the room, Clifford attacks him immediately. The two men go at each other then, and as expected, Millers is the winner in the end. He reminds Clifford of the time he was lying wounded. And when he stood over him, he saw a fear of life and a longing for the end in his eyes. Even then, Millers realized what kind of miserable men fill the top tier of society. All Clifford can do now is order him to vacate the land and refuse to sign a divorce. Oliver explodes in anger in response to this, but Constance stops him. She tries a different approach to Clifford. To honor the love they once had, she asks Clifford to make one last sacrifice. After the couple leaves, Clifford reflects on something. Pain and unimaginable sorrow, merged with bitterness, paint his face until he makes a decision. When he comes out, Millers and Constance are already far away, and he screams at them as loudly and as resentfully as he can. They will have a divorce, they are free. And so, with this, the life of Lady Chatterley is over, and an adventure full of honest love and uncertainty awaits.